Today's talk is on, yesterday we talked about what was post-Keynesian, some of the fundamental ideas, uncertainty, historical time, endogenous money, effective demand. Today we're going to talk about how the institution of post-Keynesian economics came about. Who were the people involved in creating post-Keynesian institution, and when and how did that happen and how did that arise? So, like I mentioned, this is post-Keynesian economics at 50, because sort of the starting date is 1975 with the publication of that famous paper by Eichner and Kregel in 1975, Journal of Economic Literature. So 2025 marks about 50 years, and it's called The History of an Institution. Before we begin, one of my favorite quotes by Keynes: "My only regret in life is that I should have drunk more champagne." So when Keynes went from Cambridge to London by train, he would reserve an entire wagon and bring a lot of friends, sometimes young men, as we know, but he would bring cases of champagne to be drunk on the wagon. And so I think it's just such a great quote from such a distinguished man that I just love. Okay. I want to look at the two things I want to do today. The first is to look at the theoretical, no, I'm going to do the institutional first. The institutional history of post-Keynesian economics. And then I'm going to look at the theoretical history of post-Keynesian article, both comprising what Lavoie calls the institutionalization of post-Keynesian economics. It's based on two articles that you have in your reading list. And essentially is how did it emerge as an institution? And before I begin, I wanted to talk a little bit about that project I mentioned, the history of post-Keynesian economics that I'm going to be publishing in 2025. And here are the countries and the individuals that will be writing those histories for those respective countries. And in Brazil, I said it was Lydia Berlin, but it's Daniela Guizzo and others. And we've got China and France and Spain and Poland and Mexico and Italy and India, Germany, with Eckert Hein, Engelbert Stockhammer doing it for Austria. So it's a very massive project. Now, we need to do two things. If we're going to talk about post-Keynesian economics, theoretical or historical institutional features, we need to define post-Keynesian economics. We did that yesterday. And we've got to define exactly what is a school of thought, what's an institution. And really, an institution is the emergence of an identifiable group of economists around specific social networks, conferences, journals, organizations, textbooks, workshops, summer schools, and then versus the theoretical, I should have maybe switched these things around, but the history of the theory, and of course some of these ideas go back to the classical schools, of course, the concepts of power and social classes and income distribution. But I'm going to bring the story a little bit closer to the present by looking at, I'm interested, when I was writing this paper, I was interested, is there something, is there a publication that we can point to and say, That's the beginning of Post-Keynesian economics. Does that publication exist? Maybe it doesn't. Maybe it's something that just came together, or it took many times, or whether there is a publication, and what, if so, what is it? Which publication is it? So I'm going to do that later on. And I'm going to be talking more about this on Friday when I talk about the future of post-Keynesian economics. But 2022 looks nothing like the 1970s. 1970s, the early 70s, there was nothing in terms of post-Keynesian institution. But today, you know, the Real World Economics Review, 28,000 subscribers. Look at what we can call the post-Keynesian influencers on social media. You have a number of universities now in the United States alone. The New School where I went, Amherst, Bucknell, Utah, Colorado State, Missouri, Kansas City, and not to mention a number of places here in Brazil alone, Campinas, Rio de Janeiro, Para, and other places as well that are emerging as centers of heterodox thought. I could have put Porto Alegre and other places. So I think the Rethinking Network has something like, I can't remember, 100 different chapters around the world, Rethinking Economics, Poland, France, Canada, etc. So it is quite, I think that the institution has grown a lot, and that's going to bring us into the discussion over its future. Now, this is what we discussed yesterday, the elements that we're going to come back and revisit. And like I said, the emergence of an institution, what makes an institution are associations, conferences, workshops, summer schools, journals, books, textbooks. New Keynesian synthesis really started coming together with the publication of Samuelson's textbooks on economics. And that's sort of what prompted the development of that school. The ideas, right? Ideas always sort of develop before. People have ideas, and then people start coalescing around the ideas, around the people. Someone writes a textbook, and then from there. And that's why I remember years ago, for the record, there is no American Post-Keynesian Association. Paul Davidson always resisted the idea. He always thought that that association might take control of the JPKE. So there was never one that was created. But I remember asking Paul, maybe 20 years ago. Yeah, because I got my PhD in '98, so certainly 20 years ago. And I asked him, I said, you should write a textbook. There's no textbooks. Right, a textbook is significant. This is where you start getting the undergraduate students. Then they go, right? And Paul says, well, no one wants to publish a textbook from the Post-Keynesian. And I think he was right at the time. But today, there are quite a few textbooks. Lavoie's textbook, my own textbook, Setterfield's textbook with Blecker. So there are quite a few textbooks. But none really are a textbook like the mainstream has. Simple ideas, even mine. When I was telling authors, let's do a textbook and edit a textbook, you know, a lot of these chapters are not a little bit complicated for first or second year. But we need someone to be able to sit down and write a real textbook. So Lee, Fred Lee, who knows the name of Frederick Lee? Raise your hand. Now, Fred Lee was this institutionalist, American institutionalist, very well known for his views on markup pricing, and very interested in the history of post-Keynesian economics. He wrote In the early 1970s, there was no national academic organizations anywhere in the world that heterodox economists could identify with. Now there was ERPI was there, but they were Marxists, but nothing post-Keynesian in that sense. There was no academic economic journals to which to submit papers. There was no annual economic conferences or nationally oriented seminars. In short, with the exception maybe of Cambridge University, almost no local, no regional, no national organizations anywhere in the world in place in the early 70s. He called it an intellectual wilderness. Okay? 1970s is only 50 years ago. There were some publications. Now, who knows of the name of Paul Davidson? He's still alive, by the way. There were some books. Certainly the writings of Joan Robinson, the writings of Nikki Caldor, certainly the book Money in the Real World, Paul's first book in 1972. Now, that book, like I said, was written while Paul was a visiting scholar at Cambridge in 1971. Now, coincidentally, who knows the name of Basil Moore? Basil Moore? And so Basil Moore wrote this very famous book called Verticalist and Horizontalist, which sort of established the theory of endogenous money for post-Keynesians. Now, that book was published in 1988, 35 years ago, by Cambridge University Press, and I am happy to announce that Routledge, I now own the rights to that book, and Routledge will be publishing that book next year with an extended introduction by Marc Lavoie and myself on endogenous money in the place of Basil. But Basil was at Cambridge in 1971 as well, and was right next door to Paul's office, and we became good friends. That was the beginning of sort of the reflection on endogenous money. But there was no post-Keynesian school to speak of. There were some publications here and there. Now, eventually, we would get in 1977 the Cambridge Journal of Economics. In 1978, we would get the Journal of Post-Keynesian Economics. And there were some other publications. Certainly, Thanos Scarce in 1975. You had the Thames papers in political economy. The first paper was by Joan Robinson on equilibrium. I have the original publication at home, and I have a lot of those original publications. They were little tiny booklets. Now, in order to find those booklets, you had to go into you couldn't find them online, you had to go to a library. A library is a place that you go to consult books. And books are, I once had a student who came to me, an undergraduate student, this may be for 5 years. She said, "Sir, I found this book in the library, and it's perfect for my dissertation. But I don't know if I can use it because I couldn't find a copy of it online." I said, "It's legitimate." Okay. Yeah, so there was and that was sort of a publication, and Scarce started, he's still alive, and I was texting with, emailing with him not too long ago, asking questions about that. And then, there was this sort of idea that there was this impression that there was no outlet for, not per se the Cambridge people, they were publishing in journals, the economic journal, but for the younger people, younger students coming up to publish papers. Now, today, of course, we are very much ostracized. We can't publish in the American Economic Review and everything. But back then it was even worse because they didn't have the JPKE or the Cambridge Journal. So this was the first sort of serial publication where maybe students could start writing. And I have a list of, I think I have a list of papers that were published early on in those, but they were certainly the big Caldors and Robinsons that were publishing there at first to get it started. Now, I think that the institution, the idea of creating an association of post-Keynesians started in the United States. Certainly there was no attempt, apart from the Thames Papers, to create an institution in the United Kingdom. Partly because Pazinetti has a great, who has heard about Pazinetti? Luigi Pazinetti? A few good. So he wrote a good paper on the Keynesian, the Cambridge and the Keynesians, in which he argues, well, you know, those Cambridge people, they didn't like each other. And they didn't like working with each other. They were all about egos, they're all about themselves. Joan Robinson was about Joan Robinson, not about starting a group to work with Caldor, to work with Richard Kahn. Richard Kahn, anyone knows Richard Kahn? And we gotta talk. They were all dysfunctional. They were very dysfunctional. Now, in 1969, Alfred Eichner. Now, Eichner was an American institutionalist who was known for his theory of markup pricing, oligopolistic concentration. And he started writing to Joan Robinson. And back then, you had to write letters that you put in the post. And he would write to Joan Robinson about his theory of markup pricing. And they wrote back a lot, back and forth. And they started having a correspondence. And in that correspondence, the word post-Keynesian came up. And it was the first time that, you know, Eichner said to Joan, I don't know if I have I think I have it in the next slide. But it's at that time that Eichner tells Robinson, I refer to the kind of work that I'm doing as, I don't know the quote, as sort of the Joan Robinson post-Keynesian theory school. And Joan had talked about, I shouldn't say Joan, I didn't know her, but Robinson started using the expression, and it had been maybe a little bit earlier as well. Now, just as a side note, John King, in his book Post-Keynesian Economics, which I don't quite like, he says Post-Keynesian economics begins in 1936 with Keynes. I find that very hard to believe. You can't have a school called Post-Keynes starting with Keynes. I much prefer Eichner's sort of definition, which is Post-Keynesian economics is about building on the work done by some of Keynes' closest allies. So in fact, he argues that post-Keynesian economics is not directly related to Keynes, but to the work of his students. Most notably, he was referring specifically to Joan Robinson, to Nicholas Caldor, and those people. Now, for me, and I've sort of alluded to this yesterday, I'm not sure how post-Keynesian Keynes really was. This said, I fully realize that Keynes said, you know, when confronted to facts, to new facts, I changed my mind, what do you do, sir? And we know that he was not happy with the general theory. We know that he was in the process of rewriting the book. And, you know, he says to Robinson, I'm in the process of writing notes for a new version of the general theory. So I think that maybe he would have, a second edition, if he had not died so suddenly in 1946, I think a second edition would probably have looked very different for Keynes, but we don't know. And this is a quote by Caldor that I referred to yesterday. The author of the Neoclassical Synthesis was not Paul Samuelson, but it was Keynes himself. So, but that's fine. I think it's, you know, we don't really, the important thing is that Keynes did influence a number of people who took his teachings into a more sort of radical direction. Certainly Joan Robinson, and certainly Kalecki, that Keynes didn't find very interesting, but nevertheless, Kalecki was there, had interaction. You all know who Kalecki was? Yeah, okay. He had some interaction, he was at Cambridge, had some interaction with Keynes. And Shraffa was also at Cambridge. So the important thing is that there was sort of a melting pot of ideas at Cambridge. Some of the students came out of that. Whereas Robinson was probably the most faithful to Keynes. She's probably the one who certainly, not distanced, but moved away in many respects from the teachings of Keynes. Now, this is just a sidebar on Alfred Eichner. He was known 1979. Wrote this phenomenal little tiny textbook, A Guide to Post-Keynesian Economics. It's got a little paper, a little chapter. Now, Eichner wrote that paper in 1975 with Craighill, was never really happy. He thought it was too technical. And this little book came out as from his disappointment with the 1975 paper. And it's a little book, very easily to read, no graphs, no equations. Asimov had a chapter called Monetary Factors, very early beginnings of his views on endogenous money. And a number of other people. Market pricing was in there. So it was sort of the basic elements of post-Keynesian economics, but he was known for the megacore oligopoly, that was his, and then this book, The Macrodynamics of Advanced Market Economies, published posthumously because he died fairly young. This was published in 1987, big thick book, and that is, in my opinion, one of the best books written. He has in there sort of a very early views on stock flow analysis, balance sheet accounting to explain money. He has endogenous money in there. Remarkable book. And in fact, he was such a remarkable economist that Marc Lavoie, Mario Secchiarecci, and I edited a book in his honor to sort of revive the ideas of Alfred Eichner. And this is from the introduction of the book, 2010. Eichner must thus be considered a builder, an architect, and a consensus seeker as he worked tirelessly to develop the post-Keynesian institution.
Excuse me, this macrodynamics, when it was published?
1987.
1987.
You can't find this. You can't find it. You might find it on Library Genesis. You might be able to find it there. So if you have an opportunity of picking up, if you pick this up, if you go on Library Genesis, just look through, get a sense of this publication that kind of was really fundamental for post-Keynesians, right? The 75 paper was complicated, equational. It's not a word, but I'm inventing it. Full of equations. This was simple. If you're teaching a class and you want something simple, and the articles were reprinted. The articles were published a year before, in 1978, in Challenge magazine. Challenge magazine still exists today. It was a publication from Emmy Sharp, and even today they have very simple to read articles in there. I give many of these articles to my students to read, and it's now published by Routledge because Emmy Sharp doesn't exist anymore. But they were reprinted the year later. But in this, check it out, just to look at it. And this book, if you can get a copy or on Genesis, have a look at it. It's really quite. This book is what Lavoie considers one of the best books published in post-Keynesian economics, and I agree. I mean, I read this book cover to cover a couple of times. It takes, I think, 8 years to read the book because it's so thick, but it's well worth it. And this is just a quote from Eichner. We must free economics from the intellectual dead weight of neoclassical orthodoxy. In the introduction to that book, little book that I mentioned. So you can get a sense of Eichner was a militant anti-neoclassicist. Now, in that correspondence with Joan Robinson, which began in 1969, there was a lot of back and forth, and they were talking in that, what can we do? We got to do more, we got to do more. And in 1971, by April 71, Eichner began wondering whether the time was now ripe for post-Keynesian revolution in the United States. And it was in this, like I said, correspondence that he first refers to post-Keynesian. By April 6th of 71, Eichner was now also calling this new paradigm post-Keynesian, although Eichner used it as early as 1969. In a letter to Joan Robinson in 1969, Eichner mentions that he was making his students familiar with the post-Keynesian Robinson-Caldor type of growth model. Now, in 1960, Joan Robinson writes, "My research belongs to the field of what is sometimes called post-Keynesian economics." And I take this as being pretty significant. And I've been having 10-year debate with John King, and I haven't been able to convince him. He thinks the expression was used in a chronological sense. My research is post-Keynes. I disagree, especially since she comes back to that expression later by the end of the decade to refer to a school of thought. My contention is that she was thinking in terms of an emergence. And I say this because, as I will, spoiler alert, I will argue that the theoretical, when I mentioned, is there a book that we can identify and say, this is the beginning of the ideas of post-Keynesian economics, and I believe there is, and it's the accumulation of capital in 1956. We'll see that later. So 1956, so I think Joan Robinson was very well aware of what that book was, that there was a need to sort of bring ideas together, and as you do so, and so I think that I think she was aware of what post-Keynesian economics meant in that quote. But it's a debate that I've been having. Oh yeah, and it's with the hyphen. Okay. So in 1971, I told you Joan Robinson was invited to give the Richard T. Ely talk at the American Economic Association annual conference in December, and they were held in New Orleans. She was invited by John Kenneth Galbraith, and I had dinner with Galbraith once at his house years ago. I was going to Boston for something, and I just called him. And I said, he's Canadian. I said, I'm a Canadian. MA student in economics. Can I meet you? And he goes, come for dinner. So I went for dinner, and Galbraith was like this tall. And it was quite, and I was so stupid, like when you're meeting someone that you respect so much, and I was going, like asking stupid questions. It's just so nervous. But it was quite a nice encounter. Now, when I found out that Robinson, she was the first woman to give that talk. Now, you have to understand that Joan Robinson was, a lot of people expected her to win the Nobel Prize in economics. In fact, I think Pazinetti refers to her as, how does he put it? The only non-Nobel Prize winner being considered for a Nobel Prize, something like that. They would never have given it to her. She was brash. She insulted people. She was difficult. She was a curmudgeon, and she really robbed the profession the wrong way. But it was the International Year of the Woman. I'm not, maybe 72, 73. People expected her. Even there were in the newspapers, there were stories in the New York Times about the next Nobel Prize winner in economics. She didn't get it. And that was a big disappointment, and it could have been a turning point for the profession. But when Eisner found out she was coming to New Orleans in 1971, he wrote to her, and he said, look at that. The meeting was held on December 28th, 3 days after Christmas. We don't do that anymore today. But he wrote to her, and he said that, we should get together, invite people. Let's call this the Political Economy Club. Let's invite people. Let's have a meeting to start talking about doing something. And it was a meeting that was by invitation only. It was a letter that was sent and signed by Joan Robinson. It was sent to 30 academics. 17 people accepted. And they had a meeting, sort of a clandestine meeting. And Robinson in the letter was referring to, we need to meet to discuss the vulgar version of neoclassical theory. Now you understand why she did win the Nobel Prize. She called the economics profession vulgar. And what can we do to remedy the situation? So they sent it to 30 people. And, this is just with the announcement in the annual. Back then, the programs were actually published. And this is the announcement of the Richard T. Ely as it appeared in the publication. Now, 17 people attended that talk. Who knew of Thomas Makopoulos? He was my MA supervisor. And there he died in early 90s. He was a very famous collected economist. Kenneth Boulding. Victoria Chick. Who's heard of Victoria Chick? Raise your hand. Who heard of Victoria Chick? Paul Davidson, yes. Alfred Eigner. John Gurley wrote a feminist paper from Gurley and Shaw. Donald Harris. Does anyone know Donald Harris? No, Donald Harris is a very famous historian of thought who's the father of the Vice President of the United States, Kamala Harris. Jan Kregel, who's heard of Jan Kregel? Yes. Yeah, of course. Hyman Minsky, who's heard of Edward Nell? Edward Nell. He was my PhD supervisor. Howard Sherman, Stephen Margolin from Harvard. So those were the people, and at the time, these were, and many of them are still alive, still are today, pioneers, huge, huge names in post-Keynesian economics. And it was at this meeting that it was suggested that they should create an institution called Post-Keynesian, although the name was rejected. Now, as I mentioned yesterday, that meeting was a failure. There were so many different viewpoints. Institutionalists, Marxists, classical economists, very narrow post-Keynesian with Vicky, a Kelekian, is, historian. So there were very different points of views, and that simply led to, a discord. No one could agree. And this was certainly a big history of, and not only did people disagree back then, but they were very personal about it. I disagree with a lot of people, but I go for beer with them. This is not something they did at the time. And so, Paul Davidson referred to that meeting as the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So he considered, Kelekians and, Marxists as being his enemies, but they were friends in their opposition to neoclassical theory. But lucky enough, Eichner did not give up. Nevertheless, that 1971 meeting was a watershed moment. It was an important moment in the history of post-Keynesian economics. It was the first attempt to create an association, a school, an institution. These initial activities by Eichner constituted in the United States the beginning of post-Keynesian economics as an identifiable body of ideas supported by a network of economists and institutions. So we're on our way. Eichner did not give up. In 1972, in Toronto, he organized a session called The Possibility of an Alternative to the Neoclassical Paradigm, a dialogue between Marxists, Keynesians, and institutionalists. This was the first session at a conference. It was not part of the official program. However, it was held clandestinely in a hotel room. But it was the first time a session was held to discuss an alternative to post-Keynesian, to neoclassical economics. Two papers Eichner outlined for a new paradigm in economics, and Minsky presented an alternative to the neoclassical paradigm, One View. So you're seeing people, Minsky was not at that 1971 meeting, but he was at this 1972 meeting, the second meeting, a session at a conference. In Eichner's paper, he was now referring to this new alternative as being post-Keynesian alternative. And he uses the word like 10 times in the article. And he wrote after the meeting, the session reinforced my belief that it is possible to develop an alternative to the neoclassical paradigm. Today, we take it for granted that there is an alternative, that we are an alternative. But 50 years ago, it was not evident. And also, Eichner, from the very beginning, was pitching a big tent. He's saying this alternative to neoclassical economics involved Marxists, neo-Marxists, Keynesians, post-Keynesians, institutionalists, etc. And that there are not irreconcilable differences. Okay? Yet he warns that at the same time, the development of an alternative paradigm will not be easily accomplished, especially since the members of the various schools insist on emphasizing entirely different types of problem. And he's right. While the ideas are not irreconcilable, feminists might have different, ecologists may believe in no growth or degrowth, or we have different ideas, but I think what Eichner was saying, and certainly my belief, is we share many core ideas that makes it possible. And to this day, I should add, there still has not been an article written by these Marxist, neo-Marxist institutionalists that says these are the core principles. And this is what I talked to you about. I'm trying to do with a little group of Marxist, neo-Marxist institutions, Keynesians, etc. Try to, 50 years in the making, that would have been, if we're successful. Now, in 1973, Eichner comes back, and here proposes post-Keynesian theory as a teachable alternative macroeconomics. It's the first time that the word post-Keynesian appears in a session. The previous year, the session was called the possibility of an alternative. This year, 1 year later, post-Keynesian, 1973. Now, this is where he presented his paper that would later become the Eichner-Kregel paper 2 years later. And this is the little sort of announcement. Ednell gave a paper. Don Harris, right, the father of Camilla Harris, and Alfred Eichner, Investment and Pricing in the Megacore. These was the early beginning of his 75 paper. A year later, 1974, again at the AEA, he organized alternative approaches to economic theory. Kregel presented a paper, I can't read this, Lawrence something? I can't read it. Anyways, Kregel and Eichner, Post-Keynesian Theory, the New Paradigm in Economics. And there's another paper here by, I can't read it, John Schwartz. Anyways, but so this was again, so there was a meeting in 1971, session 72, session 73, session 74, all organized by Alfred Eichner. And then he was encouraged because these sessions were being more and more attended. And Eichner felt that the larger audience which attended the session went away with the impression that post-Keynesian theory was beginning to emerge. Very exciting. And that led to the paper eventually of 1975. It was the first paper. Now, Kregel in 1973 published his book on political economy, which was subtitled Post-Keynesian. And Kregel had been influenced by that 1971 meeting to use the word post-Keynesian. Very much in league, well, Kregel was, a student of John Robinson, so of course, and so that's no surprising. But in an academic journal, this is the first article, 1975. And in the paper, they describe 4 elements of what consists of post-Keynesian economics. Growth, income distribution, I can't remember the 2 others. I should. But nevertheless, interestingly enough, I recently found so after that, there were nothing organized. I think because the paper came out in 75, but there was nothing organized at the AEA between 75 and 78. And they were trying to finish the paper for the 1975. It was a difficult paper to get published. It was almost rejected. But Kregel was not enthusiastic about the paper. I also seem to recall that he had written out a complete text on his own, which he sent to me for comment. In my usual tactless way, Kregel is very tactless, that's true. I told him that it would do more harm than good if, against all the odds, he did manage to get it published the way it was. Rashly, I only told him that what was wrong with the piece, but also told him how it should be revised. A new draft came to me by return post, and I had magically become co-author of the paper. But that paper was interesting. It was followed a few years later by a paper by Nino Shapiro. No one knows Nino Shapiro. Yeah, she passed away not too long ago, unfortunately. But this paper from hers is rarely cited, and I think it's a better paper than the Eichner-Kregel paper, because the Eichner-Kregel, Eichner himself was not a big fan of his own paper. That was too complicated. But Nina wrote this paper, The Revolutionary Character of Post-Keynesian Economics, in 1977. A mere few years after they started meeting. So you see this ball gathering, I don't know where I'm going with that, but the ball being rolled, I'm trying to, I don't know. But the paper makes the same arguments, but I think much better written than the Eichner. If you can pick up that paper, read it, it's wonderful. It's really a wonderful paper. I should read it again, in fact, in a few years. Now, Kregel was saying that Alan Meltzer tried desperately to kill the paper and not getting it published in the Journal of Economic Literature. On my own, I would never have thought about doing the thing in the first place, and would have given the project up as a bad job after the first round of abusive comments by the referees. It was atrocious. I spoke to Kregel about it. It was, you know, you've all gotten maybe some, if you've submitted papers, some negative comments, but apparently this was well beyond the scope of negative comments. But Eichner pursued it. Kregel told me that he helped, but he wasn't giving it up. Eichner is the one who pushed it through. So Eichner organized the first meeting. Eichner organized the subsequent meetings in 72, 73, 74. Eichner wrote the paper, added Kregel's name, and Eichner is the one who pushed through with the revisions of the paper. You know where I'm going with this. So finally there was this, and the Journal of Economic Literature today is ranked number 8th journal in the world. It was a big journal at that time too. So there was a paper that was published in 75. In 1977, Eichner, who was at Rutgers University with Paul Davidson, Sidney Weintraub, who I'm sure you've never heard of, but Sidney, and then they said, let's do a conference. This was the first post-Keynesian conference ever in 1977 at Rutgers University. And the aim of the conference, and I found the program as a forum for the exchange of ideas, scholarship by those economists whose work falls within the tradition established by Keynes, Kalecki, Robinson, Kaldor, and Schraffa. This is pure Eichner, who saw post-Keynesian economics as being, right, taking the best of everything, of everyone. The conference brought together leading post-Keynesians. They were Eileen Applebaum, who's still around today, John Burbidge, who wrote a paper in the Eichner's Guide in 79, Paul Davidson, Eichner, Jeff Harcourt as well, Jan Kregel, Fred Lee, Robin Maris, Will Milberg, who's at the New School now, Dean, Jaime Minsky, Bazemore, Edward Nell, Stephen Ruseyas, big name in the 60s and 70s, Lawrence Seidman, Nina Shapiro, Laurie Tarshish, big Keynesian, Sidney Weintraub, amongst others. And it included Mario Scicareccia, who was a PhD student at McGill University, who drove down to that conference. And that's going to be important because Mario Scicareccia was involved with, let's call them the American post-Keynesians, but very close to Alain Parguez from the French secret tradition that we'll discuss later. And so we're going to see now these two approaches sort of coming together. Okay? And that conference was a huge success. And at that conference, at that conference, this is where Sidney Weintraub said, damn it, we need our own journal. And Sidney Weintraub's student was Paul Davidson. And together, with the generous support of John Kenneth Galbraith, created the Journal of Post-Keynesian Economics. Now, Alfred Eichner was very friendly with Emmy Sharp. Emmy Sharp was a publisher, the Edward Elgar of that time, if you will. And Sharp was willing to publish. He published a guide to post-Keynesian economics. He was willing to publish heterodox stuff. No one at the time would, but he did. And Eichner convinced Sharp to publish the JPK in 1978 with the generous support of Galbraith. Now, the year before, and we'll get to this in a second, the Cambridge Journal of Economics was published in 1977. It was published because of the generous support from Sraffa. Sraffa is gave the seed money to create the Cambridge Journal of Economics. At that time, Cambridge journals were not online. They were all printed. It required there were costs involved. Today, you can start a journal online if you want. It's for free, it doesn't cost anything. Very different dynamics, of course, at that time. And this was the announcement of the JPKE in the annual program of the American Economic Association. $12 for students to subscribe to the JPKE. Of course, Joan Robinson was on the editorial board, wrote the first paper. No, she was not on the editorial board. I don't think so. She wrote in the first issue. Now, that 1977 conference was very successful. And it led to other conferences, notably a conference at the University of Ottawa. That's where Mario Sequeira and Marc Lavoie were in 1981. Sequeira was hired in 1978. He was still a PhD student at McGill, but he was hired in 78. Marc Lavoie was hired in 1979. 2 years later, they had this major Post-Keynesian conference in 1981. Then there was another conference at Rutgers in 1981 as well. There was another one in Ottawa in 1984, which I remember attending. I didn't know what the hell who these people were, but I was an undergraduate student, and I remember meeting Paul Davidson there in 1984. Now, I started so I guess that was my first exposition view of post-Keynesian, but I took Lavoie's class only in 1986, called Explorations in Post-Keynesian Economics, by the way. That's where I took the title for this class. But in 84, I remember attending, and I remember meeting Paul Davidson and Basil Moore, and I remember Basil, who I was very, very close to, Basil sitting me down. I was young, I was 20 years old. Basil Moore was talking to me, encouraging me. And he became a very close friend over the years. But you can see things started. Now, workshops, conferences, journals, publications. We're getting all the elements required. And there were, of course, the Malvern conferences that began in 87. John Phoebe, who was a British economist, started these conferences in Malvern, England, and annual conferences. And that led to the creation of the Review of Political Economy. Just 2 years later, in 1989, John Phoebe was the editor-in-chief. Gary Mongiovi and Steve Pressman were the associate editors at the time. So that was sort of the early beginnings of post-Keynesian economics. And so if there's one thing that I wanted to stress is two things. First of all, post-Keynesian economics as a school and institution began in the United States, not in England. And also, Eichner was really the driving force to create post-Keynesian economics. Now, this is what I was referring to. Nothing was happening in the UK. According to Pazinetti, the Cambridge group certainly misbehaved in the process of organizing a proper school. They often displayed individualistic attitudes, egoistic behavior, rather than adopting a spirit of cooperation. The voices were sometimes discordant. Though they always agreed on fighting the neoclassical school, they often quarreled amongst themselves, usually over trivial issues. So, in other words, the UK, this great seat of Keynes and Cambridge economics, was not where post-Keynesian economics began. This individualistic behavior certainly contributed to the failure to create a post-Keynesian or heterodox school in the United Kingdom in earlier 1970. This would arrive in 77 with the creation of the Cambridge Journal of Economics. But before the CJE, there was no national academic organization that heterodox economists could certainly could identify with and be drawn to. There was no academic journal to which to submit papers. There was no annual economic conferences or nationally oriented seminar to attend. And this would later, would come later. And it was a very different development because in the United States, meetings occurred, a conference, and then a journal. In the United States, in the United Kingdom, it was the other way around. The Cambridge Journal was first created, and that led to a number of conferences and workshops. But it changed in 76. The Economic Journal, for which Keynes was editor, which was, at Cambridge, was moved to Oxford University. And for the first time in all of its history, since 1891, there would be no representatives from Cambridge on its editorial board. This was the first time. This move was a catalyst for change, and in this sense, the creation of the CJE was a defensive action, according to Ashwani Saith, that I mentioned yesterday. But 2022 is the paper published in the JP in my rope. But simultaneously, a tremendous proactive initiative. To be clear, the idea of creating a Cambridge Journal has been floating around for several years, but nothing ever happened. But when the Economic Journal moved to Oxford, this is when people said, this can't happen. The move then led to fears that it would become closed to Cambridge-type economics. So a few years before, in anticipation of the move, John Eatwell, Ajit Singh, Bob Rowthorne believed it was time to create a new journal. Over time, they would have control. The Cambridge Journal of Economics would be that journal. Eatwell writes, in late 75, Ajit Singh, Bob Rowthorne, Frank Wilkinson, and John Eatwell held a number of dinner meetings at a restaurant called La Garçonne in Mill Road, Cambridge, to discuss the creation of a new journal. According to Ashwani, the creation of the Cambridge Journal was instrumental as it provided a flagpole for the assembly of the community of heterodox economics in Cambridge. And it strengthened the community by explicitly linking the older and the younger generation in a real sense. The creation of the Cambridge Journal was made possible in part because of the financial contribution from Schraff. So like I said, it was sort of, the journal came first, and that journal was the flagpole to, now, just to be clear, and to be transparent. This story about the Cambridge Journal and how it came about is told in many publications, many publications. However, I wrote to Murray Milgate at the time, and he said, nah, this is false. I don't know how this story began. This is not how it happened. I don't know how it happened, but that's not how it happened. So I spoke to Rowthorne. He says, no, it's a pretty accurate story. So anyways, and like I said, when I published this article in Rope by Ashwani, the people at Cambridge Journal, because he wrote a paper on the history of the Cambridge Journal, and the people at Cambridge were pissed off with me. Why? How dare? It was, how dare I publish? I should have, I did. Now, also, there were a few years later, like I mentioned, the Thames Papers. And this is, some of the papers, Joan Robinson's famous paper, History versus Equilibrium, was published as the first Thames paper in 74. That's the one I have. Harcourt, Capital Theory, Much Ado About Something, famous paper of his. And then Vicky Chick. Harcourt again, Eichner. I'm not sure why I repeat his name. Maybe I like him so much I repeated him. But the Post-Keynesian paradigm and macrodynamic modeling. Basil Moore unpacking the Post-Keynesian black box in 1984. We're going to talk a lot about Basil Moore tomorrow when we talk about endogenous money and how those ideas came about. Philip Orestes and Paul Davidson. Now, Philip Orestes was instrumental. He was sort of the Eichner of Britain. If there's a post-Keynesian community in Britain, it's because of Philip Orestes. So he became editor of the Thames Papers in 1983. He had organized a conference in 1982. So he was organizing now, this was post-Cambridge Journal, but he organized a conference. He invited Eichner to be the keynote to that conference. And so from that point on, there were conferences and workshops and all of that. And that was largely the result of Orestes. So if Eichner can be considered the one who created post-Keynesian economics in the US, Orestes should be credited with having created a post-Keynesian school in the UK, not US. And by then, the two groups were overlapping. Now, there was resistance from the Paul Davidsons, post-Keynesians, because they mistrusted the Cambridge. They were too radical. They were, and Paul was very, very faithful to Keynes. And as I said, Joan Robinson was a student, but she was not moving away as much as developing Keynes, the more radical ideas in Keynes, along more of the Kleckian lines. So Paul didn't like that. Paul wanted to remain faithful to Keynes, and still is. But they were overlapping. Now it was not unusual to see Orestes, Chick, Sheila Dow, Wynne Godley, Harcourt, Craigle, Robinson. She was on the board of the JPKE, and similarly on the board of the Cambridge Journal. So there was overlapping, and they were going at each other's conferences now. And you saw this emergence of more of a world post-Keynesian school emerging from there on. I was speaking with Ashwani Saif, who's doing this history of post-Keynesian economics in India, and he was telling, he went to Cambridge, but he was saying, people in India, we had nothing. We had nowhere to publish. No one was defending these ideas. And it was, today it's a little bit different. Okay. Arestus was a post-Keynesian economist with missionary zeal. Okay, so that's sort of, I don't want to talk about what happened after. I'm less interested. But that was the early, there's too many things to talk about today. But back then, there was one event. And that was the history of Post-Keynesianism. How about the intellectual history? Now, we know about the institutional history. But is there a single post-Keynesian publication that offers an all-encompassing approach to something that we can call post-Keynesian? There were many contenders. Of course, we can think of Caldor, 1956 paper, Robinson, but these were individual papers that were focused on one topic, growth. So I'm not considering them as possible beginning points for post-Keynesian theory. They were too narrow. They certainly contributed to it, but they were too narrow. There was not much being published in the 1940s. This was the years of the war. There were very few. There was Harrod's book towards the end of the 40s. But the 40s, there was not much. And Harrod, again, was very sort of a narrow book. Doesn't talk about endogenous money. Doesn't talk about anything like that. Yeah, the 1940s was a total interruption. I have to verify the date of that 1943 paper. Maybe it was 43. Anyways, Joan Robinson published a little 40-page pamphlet that I mentioned yesterday. It was very good. I can send it to you. You should read it. It's a great read. It's just in very simple language. She just tells a story, which is how I like to do my economics. 1947, Tarshish published The Elements of Economics. Silas Labini published something in 49. But these were, they had some elements of post-Keynesian theory, but they don't have everything. Tarshish books, of course, stands out. He was a very well-known Keynesian. It touches on employment, growth, money, discusses both micro and macro and more. It's in the spirit of Keynes. Yet in today's vocabulary, we would call it perhaps more neo-Keynesian than post-Keynesian. His treatment of money is too orthodox, certainly. So I don't consider that book. Harrod's book, as I said, many interesting ideas, certainly consistent with post-Keynesian economics, but too narrow. Certainly very influential. Esteban Perez Caldente wrote a book a couple of years ago on Harrod, which is worth picking up, but the book was too much on economic growth. Robinson's pamphlet, 40 pages, contains far-reaching ideas on unemployment, money, endogenous money. In general, in a slump, it is not a lack of finance, but poor prospects for profit, which is the seat of the trouble. I quoted that yesterday. Uncertainty. Firms producing consumption goods would make greater profits if they had sufficient confidence. But beyond that, there's a lot of lacking. But it's certainly a very good beginning. Matthias says that the three books that mark the modern birth of post-Keynesian is Money in the Real World, Minsky's book, and Eichner's Guide to Post-Keynesian Economics. Okay, I'm willing to consider those. Paul's book, I'm not a fan of Paul's theory of money. Minsky certainly, but doesn't really discuss money. And all these books are good. They're good. But they were published, in the 70s. And if there was nothing before that, I would say, fine. I would say, fine. But I think there is an earlier book, and I mentioned it, and it's The Accumulation of Capital. I think in that book you have everything that I mentioned yesterday. Endogenous money, uncertainty, growth, social classes, power, income distribution. And I think that that book was, I think, the beginning of the theoretical. As I mentioned, theory comes before. Now, John King says the book was a failure. I disagree. It's true that the book is not quoted a lot today. I'm trying to bring that back. But I think the book influenced the right people at the right time. It influenced Kriegel. It influenced Lavoie. It influenced Harcourt. So it influenced the right people at the right time. Of course, Joan Robinson was the patron saint of Post-Keynesian, the greatest woman economist, the founding mother, the pioneer in Keynesian, an icon of various strands. The first Post-Keynesian, according to Orestes, was Joan Robinson. Her influence was one of the form or another has been decisive in shaping a new and critical approach, according to Edward Nell. So it's clear that Joan Robinson was a central figure. And her book, I think, was instrumental. Now, I wonder if yeah, so this is King. I published him in Roque. I regret having asked him. He says it was a long and difficult work. So was the general theory. But people thought it was well received nevertheless. Klein says it was really the first textbook on post-Keynesian economics. This is, oh, I was going to say, wow, this is a great quote, but it's mine, I think. As a matter of fact, Robinson's book contains virtually all the elements of post-Keynesian economics as it stands today, listed above, including a very detailed account of monetary economic production, and perhaps the first articulated account of endogenous money. In other words, the book meets all the criteria of post-Keynesian economics. Eichner, it was Joan Robinson in The Accumulation of Capital who first synthesized these three different disparate visions in a single work of originality, which marks the beginning of a distinctly separate post-Keynesian theory. Kriegel argues that post-Keynesian economics is most closely associated with the writings of Joan Robinson. Lavoie and Sequeira. It is with the publication of her 56th book, The Accumulation of Capital, that we can truly discern the emergence of an overview that constitutes an alternative to the dominant neoclassical economy. Pazinetti, The Accumulation of Capital represents the central nucleus of what she perceived as a new framework for economic theory. So this is 56. So when in 1960 she says, my work is part of the post-Keynesian work, I truly believe that she was aware of what she was saying at that time. And as I said, the book influenced the right people at the right time. Asmakopoulos, Davidson, Eatwell, Eichner, Harcourt, Kriegel, Lavoie, Nell, Pazinetti, Skouras, Weintraub. In other words, and this is a paper that... Okay, well, thank you very much. Welcome back. I wanted to say that I just looked on Library Genesis, and all those 4 books are there. So If you're gonna pick up one, I would recommend that you pick up a guide, which was so influential for so many young scholars, like myself. That was published in 79. I was an undergraduate in 84, and I remember finding that guide. That's why I went to that conference. And I think most of the papers in there are rather outdated, to be honest. But it gives you an idea of how, how a very basic text. So I just added in my paper, I'm going to add a section on the various books that were being, I talked about the conferences and things like that. I'm going to add a section on the various books that were being printed in the early 70s. Now, the second part, I want to talk about the theory of the monetary circuit. It's a description of the dynamics of money. That's how I would argue it. Now, this is a great quote from Lavoie that I was referring to. It's an early quote from one of his very first papers ever published. Money is in some way endogenous, whether central banks are dynamic or not, whether they accommodate or not. Accommodation or the lack of it, liability or the lack of it, financial innovation or the lack of it, are second-order phenomena to the crucial causal story that goes from debt to the supply of the means of payment. And the reason that I said that money is endogenous because of its debt, and this was the same view of Randy Ray in his chapter 1 in 1990. I think that chapter 1 is one of the best chapters written. There's a link between money and debt. I've said money, the paper money, is a physical manifestation of debt. I don't care about paper money. Who cares about paper money? We're going digital. But it is a physical the fact that I have a $5 bill means that someone went into debt at some point to maybe pay my wage or etc. We're going to talk more about that tomorrow. This is some library Genesis. It's a remarkable book. It was published in 1996. It was a conference that was held a couple of years before. And the idea was to bring together the post-Keynesians that were now sort of well established in 1990s. It was 20 years after the first meeting. Journals, publications, books. And this was an attempt to bring together the post-Keynesian and the circulation approaches, also known as the secretist approach, that developed in France and Italy during that same period that we were talking about. Edward Nell, a professor at the New School, my PhD supervisor, and Ghislain de Laplace, Paris, who I saw recently in Italy. They came together, and he always finds it funny when I refer to this as the must-read book if you're interested in money. Lavoie, Seccareccia, Minsky, Moore, Poland, Pali. Okay, there are 30 chapters. There are some Marxists like Françoise Renversé and others. And it's all a discussion about money. And when I arrived in the New School in 1993, I think the first week I went to Ed Nell. And I said, is there anything I can work on? He says, well, we had a conference in 1990 at the Levy Institute. And he says, there's a bunch of papers there on the table. Several students tried to bring the book out, but no one succeeded. Try it. And I succeeded. The book came out because of me. It was a difficult process because all the chapters had to be edited. One of the worst was this. Paul's article was, I once said this, but he doesn't say where. And this was before computers were just beginning, so I had to find, I was well read and I kind of maybe figured out. I had to go try to find in which article Paul Davidson said this, and half the time the quote were not even accurate. But the book came out, Hoseas, and anyone who wants to study money should begin with this book. Lavoie's chapter in this book was the single most influential was the single most influential article of his. I know every article about it. I mean, I read everything. But that chapter was very influential on me. We're going to talk about it on Thursday. This is Lavoie here rejects fine-tuning and says monetary policy should not be used to regulate economic activity. What the? So it is a fantastic article, and the whole book is very good. So I'm referring a lot to sort of the early articles by Lavoie. Now, as you know, I did two Festschrift in honor of Lavoie, one on growth, one on money. And I also published two books on selected essays by Marc Lavoie, one on growth, one on money. But this is now, who has heard of Marc Lavoie? Who has never heard of Marc Lavoie? Who has never heard of Marc Lavoie? Oh, thank God. He writes in 87, he calls the theory of the monetary circuit the dynamic history of the production process. It's very institutional. It's about the creation of money, the circulation of money, and about the destruction of money. How is money created? How is money destroyed? How are profits made? And it's also a theory of distribution and accumulation. Who has never heard of Graziani? Who has never heard of Graziani? Okay. Augusto was president of the Italian Economics Association, not Post-Keynesian, just he was a senator, his son was a senator, he was very influential, a gentleman in every sense of the word. And I stayed with him in Naples. And Graziani had this magnificent villa. He showed me his library, and his library was 2 floors, 4 times the size of this room, 2 floors. And on the center table, under a glass dome, was the first edition of Copernicus that I was not allowed to touch. But Augusto was, so there are 3 sort of versions of the theory of the monetary circuit. The French circuit, that was developed largely by Alain Parguez. Who has never heard of Alain Parguez? And so Alain, I'll talk about Alain soon, but Graziani was the one who developed the Italian version Alain in France developed the monetary circuit from a Keynesian perspective. Graziani developed it from a Marxist perspective. There's a lot of overlap. And Bernard Schmidt in Switzerland developed it from his own perspective. But so Graziani wrote in the book Money in Motion, the very formation of profits is explained by the presence of money, as well, right? Keynes's, monetary economy of production. You can't have profits in real terms, as well as by the way in which money is created and introduced into the market circuit. So the word circuit is also very important, right? If you think of current, an electrical circuit, you see the circuit flowing around. So the theory of the monetary circuit is about stocks and flows, the flows of money, stocks of savings, and how they interact with each other. And there are largely 5 phases. This is based on an article I wrote, one of my very first articles in 1999, Journal of Economic Issues. And there's largely 5 stages. The first is, and what the monetary circuit does, it allows you to sort of get your thoughts together. It's a theory of sequential analysis, which is very post-Keynesian. Nothing is determined simultaneously. You can't produce unless you hire workers. Well, you can't hire workers unless you have the funds to hire them, which is when you approach a bank. Right? There's a sequence of events that must be. And if investment determines savings, it's because a firm borrows money to invest, which creates employment, and workers consume and save. Savings appear at the end of the story, not at the beginning. This is not a real economy where you save corn in order to plant it. You can't save savings. They don't exist yet. You have to go through a process, a sequence. And the first sequence begins with production. Production, how much to produce, based on expectations of aggregate demand in the near future, Keynes tells us. Who's going to buy my goods? And once you've got your production decisions, then you have to decide on how many workers you're going to hire. And if you're going to hire workers and buy material goods for the production, then the second phase is you got to get what's called initial finance. You got to get some funding. You got to go to a bank. Keynes' famous line, credit is a pavement along which production travels. If you want to produce, you got to get it loaned. Because you don't have savings. They don't exist yet. So you've got to find a way. Keynes tells us that finance, bank loan is the interregnum during the period between production and sales. So you go to a bank, and we're going to talk more about that tomorrow. I don't want to say too much about it. We're going to talk more about it. But the bank has to approve you. And once you get funding, that's the initial finance. So now, as you pay your workers, you take your credit from the bank, which is debt. So now there's a relationship between debt and production. Production goes forward because you've accepted to get into debt. And the bank has accepted to give you that debt. Why? We're going to look at it tomorrow. And as you pay your workers, you deposit money into their accounts. The creation of money. So there's a link between production, debt, and money. Money exists because of debt. In neoclassical theory, when you teach principles and you tell students theory of investment, theory of labor, wages, there's no money. Wages exist. You pay people in corn. You talk about wages. You talk about labor, employment, growth, investment, consumption, production. And then at the end of the class, you talk, right? If you look at a textbook, chapter 20 is money. Schumpeter called that real analysis. In a Keynesian tradition, or the Schumpeterian tradition, money must be talked about at the very beginning of the analysis. You cannot talk about employment, labor, wages, growth, investment, interest, profits, without having a theory of money. And this is what Graziani was saying. Profits exist because of. So the banks, right? Keynes tells us that banks are special. The banks validate the production needs of the economy. Okay? And this is the ex nihilo, from nothing, creation of money. Step 3, theory of banking decisions, like I said, this is why does a bank give you credit and you refuse credit. We're going to look at that tomorrow. 4th step, the creation of income flows and the efflux principle. So what happens is, once I have a debt and money is created, right? This is the nature of money. Money is by nature endogenous because it's linked to debt. There's no central bank in my analysis. You don't need a central bank to have a theory of endogenous money. That's the mistake that many post-Keynesians have made, to identify endogenous money with a bank, with a central bank. Vicky Chick's stages of evolution, that I think is, here you don't have a central bank. Money is created and is endogenous because of the demand for credit, and banks simply give you the credit if they accept. And once you pay income, then comes monetary circulation. As you consume, right, the first is the firm gives you employment, you have an income. Then you consume. Then that money returns to the firms. And this is the efflux. Sorry. As the money is created, that's the efflux, the circulation of money through consumption. And then as you consume, money returns to the firms. And they use that money to pay back their debt towards the bank. In which case, we call that the destruction of money. So the monetary circuit is about the creation, circulation, and destruction of money. It is about the history of money in that process. The reflux mechanism is that money returns to the banks. And with that money, they are allowed to pay back the bank, reduce their debt. And if they want to start a new round of production, they must get a new debt, a new loan. And so that period of production The time involved in that period of production is the time between the creation and destruction of money. And at the end of the circuit, two things happen. Profits are created. And savings exist. Savings exist. So savings appear at the very end. They are, according to Eichner, a residual. They're not causal. Well, they could be causal. If we save too much money, then not enough money returned to the firms, so they can't reimburse the totality of their debt. And if we save too much money and firms are unable to repay their debt, then banks might say at the next production process, well, we don't want to lend you money again, because obviously you can't pay back your debt. The only thing that banks are interested in is, can you make enough money to pay me back? That's the reason. In that sense, Alain Pariez talked about bank lending as a bet, how banks bet on the firm's ability to generate sufficient revenues to pay back. Now, the consumption is money that flows back, reflux back to the firms. And then there's savings. And the savings can be divided into two types of savings: the financial savings and the hoarded savings. Hoarded savings is money you keep in your bank account. That's your bank deposits, your savings. Financial savings is money that you use to buy financial assets. If you're buying assets from firms, that money goes back to firms, is part of the monetary flux, reflux. Keynes tells us there is no difference between consumption and savings from the point of view of the firm. He meant financial savings. That's all money that goes back to the firm. And the firm pays back the bank. The hoarded savings is what firms are not able to get back from their initial injection into the circuit. They borrow $1 million and they're able to recoup only $900,000. So at the end, that's the amount of money they cannot reimburse banks. And if banks become a little bit too pessimistic, they might say, you can't sell your products, you can't pay us back, we're not going to lend you again. So there's a potential of crisis here. The crisis comes from within the circuit. Very Minskian in that sense, but then again, not very. But it's the possibility of a crisis is if the circuit cannot close itself. It begins by lending, and the money goes back to firms and back to banks. If too much money is not returned to banks, that might set in motion a potential crisis. And you have here, for example, here you have where are firms? Yeah. Oh yes, this is how I did it. These are equations. WN, which is the wage rate times labor. Anyways, you have here the private sector divided into the investment producing good sector and the consumption goods sector. Consumption goods sector, they produce consumption goods, and they buy their capital goods from the investment sector. in order to begin production, they must buy capital goods from the investment sector, and then they produce an output, and then wages are paid to workers in both sectors. Workers consume money, which then flows back to the firms. Then you have their savings, which is what we call liquidity preference. Their preference for liquidity, their preference to remain liquid. And that liquidity preference is divided into financial savings and bank deposits. So whereas this is a flow of money, this is a stock of money that appears at the end of the circuit. And this money now flows back to commercial banks. And the wages that they buy, that they spend, they consume, returns to firms, and they reimburse the bank. This is a simple theory. And by the way, you can see the very beginning of stock flow analysis. You have the flow of money, the stock of money, and you're following where money goes. You're following the circuit of money. Now, it's not surprising that Lavoie is a leading circuitist and also the one who developed with Godley stock flow analysis. There's a link between the two approaches. This is sort of a theoretical or graphical representation of stock flow analysis. Simple. But it's still a simple story. It doesn't have loans to consumers. It doesn't have shadow banks. It doesn't have all of that. And now I'm writing a paper with an Italian economist called Domenica Tropiano. Do you know Domenica Tropiano? And we're using basically this, and we're adding shadow banking. We're adding all sorts of financial innovations and these financial assets that I can't pronounce the names of. And to make it more realistic. But that's essentially what the theory of the monetary circuit is. And it developed in France. And like I said, Alain Parguez was very influential and developed it from more of a Keynesian approach. Today, I'm not going to talk about Graziani's approach much, or Bernard Schmitt's. I'm going to focus on Alain's views. Alain was a very good friend. And how these people, very much the history, who knew what happened, and where. But I just gave you a very general view. There's much to talk about. And a lot of my ideas on endogenous money that I'll talk about tomorrow comes from the monetary circuit. So like I said, money is endogenous because of its link to bank debt, not because of central bank. I haven't even talked about the central bank. Right? And so you can see why I sort of am very critical of Vikicic's theory of the evolution of endogenous money. There's no evolution. Money is always endogenous. Joan Robinson, great quote by Joan Robinson, where she says, money was endogenous even under the gold standard. If they needed more, the mining, the activities required the creation of money. Companies always got into debt. Maybe that debt manifested itself differently. Robinson is very clear. Money was endogenous in the 16th and 17th century. Philip Orestes wrote a wonderful little paper on that. So, like I said, three people, Alain Parguez, Graziani, and Schmitt. The interesting part is the dates. The dates are Alain published a book in 1975, sort of the same year as Eichner and Kregel. The dates are matching. This seems to be this sort of awakening happening around the world. And I think that one of the thing that was happening was maybe the oil crisis, the inflation of the early 70s, certainly sort of maybe led to some people asking what's happening. So these are the main protagonists. Parguez, Le Bourgeois. Le Bourgeois wrote a very wonderful paper in 1962, not about the money multiplier, but about what Lavoie called the credit divisor. And Lavoie translated Le Bourgeois' article and published it in Europe in 1992, along with the rejoinder. But Le Bourgeois was a very important French economist. Wrote in 1962, Alain Parguez, Poulon, who's still around, at Bordeaux, Graziani, Schmidt, Marcello Missori. And so right now, I'm in the process of editing a book with two Italians on advances, what am I calling it? I think it's advances in the theory of the monetary circuit. It's going to come out with Elgar next year. And we're trying to sort of not revive, but push the theory of the monetary circuit. Because one of the criticisms of the circuit theory that many people had was that it's too simple. And we acknowledge that. And there's a lot of, so one of the things that I've been wanting to do is to push the boundaries of the monetary circuit and try to deal with all these complicated new financial realities. And how does it, and some people have called for the rejection, abandonment of the circuit approach, but a lot of us believe that it's just a question of amending it. You add shadow banking, you add something else, and you can still see the interaction of what's going on. And if anything, because the circuit is about sequential analysis, and it's about how money circulates and how finance circulates, it can easily accommodate those more complicated realities. So that's one book that I'm coming out with next year. So Alain, I'm going to focus on Alain Parguez. In 1975, so you kind of see a parallel development of critical economics in France arising. But its history is not well documented, and this is what I tried to do for the paper in John King's book. Now, I'm publishing in 2025 3 papers, one by Riccardo Rialfonso, who will write a paper on the development, quite a lot of what I did this morning, but for the Italian circuit theory. Edwin Loyeron will do a much better job than the article I wrote on the French schools, and Sergio Rossi, my longtime collaborator and co-author, will do it for Bernard Schmidt. What I am going to present this morning, Edwin was very influential in giving me a lot of information. But I had no right to write that story. It's not my story to write, but no one was doing it. So I wrote it, and Edwin will do a better version of it. And so when I mentioned the book Money in Motion, the whole purpose was that a lot of people thought that there were similarities between post-Keynesians and the European post-Keynesians at the time. And they were the European post-Keynesians. In a way, they were the European post-Keynesians. So, this is the picture I took of Alain. Alain died last year. He was a towering figure in economics within post-Keynesian circles. I don't think he's ever come to Brazil. I don't remember him telling me that. But I know he went to Mexico several times. Very severely mistreated. So Alain, as I'll show, was not only instrumental in developing the theory of the monetary circuit, but also in developing relationships with the post-Keynesians. And that will come through his friendship with Marc Lavoie and Mario Scicarreccia. Remember, Scicarreccia visited the Rutgers conference in '71. And so a few years later, Alain would start going to Ottawa on a yearly basis, and they developed a very strong relationship. So Alain visited Ottawa starting in the fall of 1981. Remember the conference in Ottawa that I mentioned in '81, Alain was there, and remained in Ottawa. He would come back every fall and spend the semester there. And that's when I met Alain at that time. But Alain was also, went to the Trieste School. I don't know if you know the Trieste School, I mentioned it yet a couple days ago. Yes, it was when they were attempting to build bridges between the Schraffians and post-Keynesians and all of those people. The Keynesians were never invited to them, but it fell apart. It was just people fighting all the time for reasons that your professor mentioned as well. Okay, now the relationship began because Lavoie studied in Paris, met Parguez sometime in '76, '77, while attending a class at the Université Paris I, which was known as Panthéon-Sorbonne at the time. And the class was given by Bernard Ducrot, who was both Parguez's and Lavoie's doctoral supervisor. Ducrot was often unable to give lectures, and Parguez would step in and lecture in his stead. And Alain was had this big, thick accent. And you've met Parguez?
So you mentioned that to me.
And Alain stayed with me a couple of times, once in New York. And Alain was known. Oh, Alain, if you took Alain out for dinner every single time, oh, I do not have my wallet. Oh, you must pay. And then he was known to drink a lot of white wine. And he stayed with me in New York City. And I gave him my room, and he stayed on the couch, slept on the couch. And Alain would come at 3 a.m. Yes, like I was saying, the Keynes and the General Theory. Blah, blah, blah. Okay, I go to bed. He was quite the character. And my imitation is very close to that. But he was a great thinker. And so he became, he would often give the lectures instead of Ducrot. And that's when Lavoie and Parguez first met. And the reason that Lavoie went to Paris is because in '76, Frédéric Poulon from Bordeaux went to Montreal, Quebec City, and met Gilles Paquet, who was Lavoie's tutorial supervisor. Lavoie was an undergraduate student, finishing 4th year. And he convinced Lavoie to go to Paris the following year. So I like those stories of chance. Lavoie was not considering to go to Paris to study. But Poulon was in Quebec that year, told Lavoie, come to Paris. And Lavoie went there, studied, met Parguez. Same reason. I like the story of how Basil Moore and Paul Davidson met. Paul was writing his book, Money in Motion in Cambridge in '71, and Basil was on his sabbatical. Now, I wrote a paper on the evolution of Basil's work and where I discussed this, it was published in Egypt. And Basil just decided to go to Cambridge just because he liked England. And he had a friend who had an office there. And met Paul Davidson. And that was the whole reason how Basil developed his theory of endogenous money. So I like these theories of happenstance. And it was the same thing with Lavoie. Just by chance, by coincidence, went to Paris to study and met Parguez. Now, Lavoie had been exposed to post-Keynesian economics as an undergraduate when he took the classes at Carleton University by T.K. Rhymes. You know that Lavoie was in the Olympics? Anyone know that? 2 Olympics for fencing. And you know, Lavoie writes on growth, post-Keynesian. He has a whole other career writing on sports economics. I don't know how he does it. And Lavoie, I remember Lavoie telling me that he read Eichner and Kragel's paper in 1975, was very much influenced by that paper. 76, goes to Paris. Parguez wrote his book in 75, which was very much influenced by Keynes. And of course, de Largentais had published a general theory into French, so it was available in French. And so Parguez wrote his book in 75 that Lavoie read once he got in Paris. Didn't know about the book, didn't know about Parguez. But Lavoie quickly realized there were similarities between the two approaches. And he wrote his very early papers in 82, 84, 85. I think 82 was in French also. So from the very beginning, right, Lavoie was already talking about the relationship, the similarities between endogenous money in the circulation approach and post-Keynesian economics. This is Parguez's book. I don't think he would have called it disequilibrium today, but nevertheless. So there was this friendship that began between Alain and Marc. And here Lavoie admits that he was very influenced, right, by the critiques by the French circulationists. But the idea here is that Alain was invited to the University of Ottawa in 1981 and would go back every year. And I took a course taught by Alain I can't remember quite what year, I think it was 84. So at the 81 conference, which was published in 82, Marc talked about, presented the paper called Post-Keynesian and Endogenous Money, while he discusses a lot of the ideas of the French circulationists. And even Kregel, who wrote years later in Monnaie Production, I'll talk about that in a second. He wrote, the circuit approach has done much to reawaken interest in Keynes's monetary theory of production and to extend it in new directions. Remember how yesterday I said, don't read Keynes if you want to understand money. Okay? And here Kregel is saying, the reason there's a lot of interest in money and endogenous money is because of the French circulation approach. Keynes' theory was very sort of orthodox, very traditional. Davidson as well. But the French circulationists, they were focused more on Keynes of the treatise on money. So there was a different sort of approach, which were a lot more Vixelian, but this idea that money is created and etc. So the circuit approach, very, very important in developing endogenous money and influencing the development of endogenous money within post-Keynesianism. Alain, in '82, published a special issue of Économie appliquée, one of the main journals in France, called La monnaie dans le circuit, money in the circuit, in which Lavoie published an article. As did Jacques-Henri, who was a professor at the University of Ottawa. And now look at this, in '82, Sidney Weintraub, you're starting to see now a crossover between post-Keynesians and circulationists. Sidney Weintraub, Kregel, Richard Arena, Poulon from Bordeaux. And you see Pargueses being keenly aware of the need to create links between the circuit approach, a commingling of circuit and post-Keynesian authors, and ideas. Very early on, Alain was very sort of, how do you call it when people have visions? There you go, visionary. Now, that '82 paper, special issue, is sort of a prequel to this Money and Production series that Alain would start publishing in 1984. That is a series that appeared in Économie Société, another very important journal. And Alain, every year, once a year, would publish a special issue, a whole issue, devoted to theory of circulation and post-Keynesianism. Alain was now pushing the boundaries and the links between the post-Keynesians and the circulation. We wrote, with Mario, we edited a book in honor of Alain Parguez, a Festschrift, and we say that this 1982 issue was Alain's first try at editing a large number of papers, which gave him the impetus to start the Monnaie et Production series a couple of years later. So, this Monnaie et Production, in 1983, now remember, 77 Rutgers, 1981 conference in Ottawa, conference in Rutgers. And the reason this is so important is today you're going, big deal. We have conferences all the time. There's 20 post-Keynesian conferences every year, if not more. But back then, there were one conference. There was the first conference, the second conference. There were not 20 conferences per year. So they're important. 81 in Ottawa, Rutgers, 84 in Ottawa again, 83. Edwin Léron with Alain Barter, they do a conference in Sorbonne in September. And they invite Nikki Kaldor, Paul Davidson, Hyman Minsky, Eisner, Kregel, Nell, Steindl, Dudley Dillard. I mean, this is a major conference. The first conference in Europe on post-Keynesian economics. 6 years after the Rutgers conference. Weintraub was supposed to be there, but it had passed away. And that led to a very big book that I have, but it was translated into English and edited as 3 books, still available. But, and what I find interesting is why were these things being developed at the same time? And they started, I think the Eichner and Kregel paper had a really large influence, and that led to people going, right, it crystallized something in people's minds, that something was happening. And at the same time, it was happening and there was a conference in Nice in 84 by Richard Arena. Richard Arena is a very, very big French heterodox economist. Now, money production. So, this was a series that Alain developed, and he was invited by François Piron, a big, big French intellectual. And Alain accepted. And you can see that from the very late, and then we could even go and start thinking about how it developed in Mexico. Because Eugenia Correa, a dear friend who passed away a few years ago from COVID, but she visited the ISMEA. And ISMEA is the one who published Économie, Société, and Économie Appliquée. And ISMEA was headed by François Piron. And in 85, Eugenia went to visit l'ISMEA in Paris, met Parguel, met Sequerecia. So that started the Mexican branch of post-Keynesian economics, of course, with Julio Lopez. And for Graziani said, as long as Monnaie en Production was published, it was the only really international connection established between French followers of the circulation approach and their counterparts in Anglo-Saxon countries. Lavoie says the same thing. It's an outlet of the writings of both French and English-speaking post-Keynesians and other heterodox economists. Pargues became the champion of Keynesian economics in France. In the very first issue in 1984, Chiladao writes a paper. Alain Pargues, Marc Lavoie, Mario Sequerecia, Heinzen and Steiger wrote their one of two famous papers on money and private property. Jacques-Henri, Crego, Arena. Graziani published in 85. And then others would publish. Vicky Chick, Husseis in 86. John Hudson, Jane Nodell in 88. Asmakopoulos, and Robert Gutman in 1990, who's been to Brazil. Arestis, Aspermorgus, Ray, Epstein in 91. Smitten, Kardim, Eisner, Hodson in 94, Steve Keen, Dalziel, Pressman, Pauli, Chrysler, Hanevi in 1996. And it ended in 1996. So, Alain, Eichner were personal heroes of mine because they were so not only into publishing their work, but publishing the work of other people. And I've tried to emulate them ever since. Now, the second book that I'm working on is Mario Sequerecia and I will publish a book of the 20 best articles from Monnaie Production, because they're not digitized and you can't find them. But that's where Crego published his paper about Hamlet and the Prince. And so Graziani's famous article on Keynes's finance motive was published in Monnaie Production. So we're going to reprint Vicky Chick's famous paper that I hate on the evolution of the banking system, was published in Monnaie Production. So we're going to publish what we consider the 20 best papers from Monnaie Production in a book for Elgar. And when Monnaie Production ended in 96, Money in Motion, that book by Edward Nell, was published. And that was just a continuation of that work. And then in 2000, I started doing, me as a post-Keynesian, with Claude Nuss, those conferences in Dijon, France. We had about 5 or 6 of those. They were instrumental in continuing the relationship between post-Keynesians and circuit writers. So, Barter should be considered like Eichner in the US, Arestis in the UK, the founder of post-Keynesian economics in France. And, in France, at least in France. That's it. Amen.